Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight, we're going underground. Parking garages. Concrete caverns beneath our cities where fluorescent lights buzz against. Endless shadows and every footstep echoes into the darkness. Places where security guards walk alone through levels that seem to stretch forever. Watching over rows of silent vehicles and empty spaces that hold more than just cars. Tonight, we have 5 true accounts from security professionals who've worked the graveyard shift in parking facilities across the country. Stories of encounters that happen when the last commuter leaves and the real residents come out to play. So dim the lights. Put on your headphones and join me as we descend into the concrete depths where some vehicles never leave and some drivers never stop looking for their cars. Story 1. The Underground Watcher. My name is Marcus, and I spent 3 years working security at the Meridian Plaza parking garage in downtown Seattle. 6 levels underground, capacity for 1,800 vehicles, and during my shift from midnight to 8 a.m., I was the only human being in that concrete tomb. The job seemed straightforward enough. Walk the levels, check for suspicious activity, monitor the security cameras, and make sure nobody was sleeping in their cars or doing anything that might cause problems for the day shift. The pay was decent, benefits were solid, and most importantly, I rarely had to deal with people. Just me, the hum of ventilation systems, and row after row of parked vehicles. The Meridian Plaza garage was built in the early 70s, back when downtown Seattle was still finding its identity. The building above housed offices, a few retail spaces, and some upscale condominiums. The garage itself was designed with efficiency in mind. Straight lines, minimal decoration, and that institutional gray concrete that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. Each level was marked with large painted numbers and arrows directing traffic flow. Though during my shift, traffic was non-existent. Level B1 was reserved for monthly parkers, mostly residents of the building above and a few business owners who paid premium rates for guaranteed spots. B2 and B3 handled daily parkers, commuters who worked downtown and needed somewhere secure to leave their vehicles. B4 was overflow parking, used only during peak times or special events. B5 and B6 were supposedly additional overflow, though in my 3 years, I rarely saw more than a handful of cars down that deep. The first few months were routine. I'd start my rounds at the security office on B1, take the elevator down to B6, and work my way back up level by level. Each level took about 20 minutes to walk completely, checking behind support pillars, looking for anything out of place, making sure all the cars belonged there. The security system tracked entry and exit times, so I could verify that every vehicle on my list had legitimate reason to be in the garage. The lighting was motion activated to save energy, so as I walked, sections would illuminate ahead of me and fade to darkness behind me, creating a moving bubble of visibility in the concrete wilderness. The sound of my footsteps echoed strangely in that space, sometimes seeming to come from multiple directions at once, bouncing off walls and low ceilings in patterns that never quite made sense. It was during my 4th month that I first noticed the car on level B5, a 1987 Buick LeSabre, burgundy with a black vinyl top, parked in space B5 to 127. Not unusual in itself. People parked older vehicles in long-term spaces sometimes, but something about it caught my attention. The car was immaculately maintained, not a speck of dust or a single door ding, like it had just rolled off the showroom floor 35 years ago. More importantly, it wasn't on any of my parking lists. Every vehicle in the garage was supposed to be registered with the management company. Monthly parkers had permits, daily parkers had tickets, and everything was tracked electronically. But this Buick had no permit visible, no ticket on the dashboard. And when I ran the license plate through our system, it came back as no record found. I called my supervisor, Janet, who handled administrative duties during day shifts. She checked the master database, contacted the management company, and even called the building's front desk. Nobody had any record of the Buick. No permit had been issued, no payment had been made. And there was no indication of how the vehicle had gotten past the electronic gate system. Probably someone found a way to tailgate in, Janet said when she called me back. It happens sometimes. Put a boot on it and we'll have it towed in the morning. I walked back down to B5 with the wheel boot, standard procedure for unauthorized vehicles. But when I reached space B5 to 127, the Buick was gone. In its place was a newer Honda Civic, with a valid daily parking ticket clearly displayed on the dashboard. I spent the rest of my shift walking that level repeatedly, looking for the burgundy Buick, checked every space twice, looked behind support pillars, even examined the exit logs to see when the vehicle might have left. According to the electronic gate system, no cars had exited the garage since 11:47 p.m., nearly 2 hours before I had first seen the Buick. The next night, the Buick was back in space B5 to 127. Same immaculate condition. Same lack of permit or ticket. Same absence from our records. This time I decided to examine it more closely before calling for a boot. I walked around the vehicle slowly, noting details. Washington state plates, current registration sticker, no visible damage or wear. The interior was clean, bench seats covered in what looked like original vinyl. And hanging from the rearview mirror was one of those pine tree air fresheners. When I tried to peer through the windows more closely, something strange happened. My flashlight beam seemed to get absorbed by the glass, as if the windows were tinted far darker than they appeared. I could see my reflection clearly enough, but the interior of the car remained stubbornly shadowed, even with my light aimed directly through the windshield. I called Janet again, explained the situation. This time she said she'd come in early to deal with it personally, maybe contact the police if necessary. Just document everything, she told me. Take photos, note the exact time and location, and we'll sort it out tomorrow. I took my phone out and aimed it at the Buick. The first photo came out completely black, as if I'd taken a picture with the lens cap on. I checked my phone. Camera was working fine, battery was charged, no obvious problems. I tried again, this time making sure the flash was enabled. The second photo was also black, though I clearly saw the flash fire. Growing frustrated, I tried a third time, positioning myself directly in front of the vehicle. The flash went off, illuminating the concrete around me, but when I checked the image, all that showed was empty space. The parking spot appeared vacant in the photo, even though I was looking directly at the Buick as I took the picture. Spent 15 minutes trying to photograph that car from every angle. 23 attempts, and every single image showed an empty parking space. Meanwhile, the Buick remained clearly visible to my eyes, solid and undeniably present. The next morning, when Janet arrived at 7 a.m., space B5 to 127 was empty. She thought I was having some kind of stress-related breakdown and suggested I take a few days off to rest. I tried to explain about the photos, about the car that couldn't be documented, but she looked at me like I was describing aliens or ghosts. The third night, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of trying to boot the car or photograph it, I would simply observe. See if I could determine where it came from, where it went. Maybe catch a glimpse of whoever was driving it. I positioned myself behind a support pillar with a clear view of space, B5 to 127 at 11:30 p.m. Half an hour before the Buick had appeared on previous nights. I waited, watching the empty space and listening to the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of traffic from the street. Above. At exactly 11:58 p.m. Without any sound of approaching engine or opening doors, the Buick simply materialized in the space. One moment the spot was empty, the next moment the car was there, perfectly positioned between the painted lines as if it had been parked there for hours. I watched for 20 minutes, but nothing else happened. The car sat motionless, no signs of occupancy or activity. No one approached it, no one left it. No one seemed to have any interest in it whatsoever. It was just there, existing in space B5 to 127, like it belonged. At 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes before Janet was scheduled to arrive, the Buick disappeared just as silently as it had appeared. I was watching directly at the moment it vanished, and there was no gradual fading or dramatic special effect. The car was there, and then it wasn't, leaving behind an empty parking space and the growing certainty that I was losing my mind. I didn't report the third night's events to Janet. Instead, I started doing research. Spent my off hours at the public library, searching through newspaper archives and city records, trying to find any mention of the Meridian Plaza garage or unusual incidents in the area. What I found was a missing person report from 1987. Eleanor Vasquez, 43 years old, worked as a night shift nurse at the hospital 6 blocks from the Meridian Plaza. She drove a 1987 Buick LeSabre, burgundy with a black vinyl top. On the night of October 15th, 1987, she finished her shift at 7 a.m., called her husband to say she was leaving work, and was never seen again. Her car was found 3 days later in the Meridian Plaza garage, parked on level B5. The investigation revealed that Eleanor had a monthly parking permit for the garage, using it as a safe place to leave her car during her night shifts. Security cameras from 1987 showed her entering the garage at her usual time, but there was no footage of her leaving the vehicle or exiting the building. The case remained unsolved. The car was eventually released to Eleanor's family and presumably sold or disposed of. The missing person file was closed after 7 years with no resolution. But according to the newspaper article I found, Eleanor's car had been discovered in space B5 to 127, the same space where I'd been seeing the Buick every night for the past week. I spent my 4th night in the garage conducting an experiment. I brought a notebook and pen, determined to document everything I could observe about the mysterious vehicle. When the Buick appeared at its usual time, I approached it slowly and began taking notes. License plate number, exact positioning, condition of the tires, any visible wear patterns or identifying marks. I noted the pine tree air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror, the slight accumulation of what looked like vintage parking permits stuck to the inside of the windshield, and most importantly, I noticed that the front seat was adjusted for someone much shorter than me. As I walked around the vehicle, something new caught my attention. The driver's side window was down about an inch, and there was a faint sound coming from inside the car. Music playing at very low volume. It took me a moment to identify the song, but eventually I recognized it as something from the 80s. A ballad with synthesizers and a female vocalist. I knelt down next to the driver's side window and listened more carefully. The music was definitely coming from the car's radio, but it had a distant quality, as if it were being played through an old transistor radio rather than a car stereo system. Underneath the music, I could hear something else, the sound of someone breathing. Slow, steady breathing like someone sleeping or resting peacefully. Someone was inside the car. I stood up quickly and aimed my flashlight through the partially open window. The beam penetrated the darkness inside the vehicle, and for just a moment, I saw her, a woman in hospital scrubs, sitting in the driver's seat with her eyes closed and her hands folded in her lap. She appeared to be sleeping, her breathing calm and regular, completely unaware of my presence. She looked exactly like the woman in the newspaper photo from 1987, down to the same hairstyle and facial features. Eleanor Vasquez. Taking a moment to rest before driving home from her night shift at the hospital, I stepped back from the car, my heart racing and my hands shaking. The logical part of my mind insisted that what I was seeing was impossible, that people don't disappear for 35 years. and then returned to sit peacefully in their cars in parking garages. But the evidence of my senses was undeniable. She was there, real and solid and breathing, existing in some kind of temporal loop that replayed the same moment over and over again. I called out to her softly, "Eleanor? Ma'am, are you all right?" She didn't respond. Her breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged. It was as if my voice couldn't reach her, as if she existed in a different layer of reality that intersected with mine only visually. I tried knocking gently on the window. No response. I tried the door handle. The door was locked, but more than that, it felt solid in a way that suggested it couldn't be opened by external force. Not because of the lock mechanism, but because the entire car existed in a state that prevented interaction with the present moment. I spent the rest of that night sitting on a concrete parking barrier about 20 feet away, watching Eleanor sleep in her car. She never moved, never woke up, never showed any awareness of the passage of time. The radio continued playing the same song on endless repeat, and her breathing remained constant and peaceful. At 7:45 a.m., she opened her eyes. For 30 seconds, Eleanor sat completely still, looking through the windshield at something I couldn't see. Then she reached forward and turned off the radio, adjusted her rearview mirror, and put her hands on the steering wheel. She looked directly at me. Her expression was calm, not frightened or surprised. She seemed to see me clearly, and for a moment I thought she might try to communicate. Instead, she smiled sadly and mouthed 2 words, "I'm sorry." Then the car vanished, leaving me sitting alone on level B5 with the certainty that I'd just witnessed something that shouldn't exist. I quit my job that morning, told Janet I was taking a position with another security company, thanked her for the opportunity, and walked away from the Meridian Plaza garage forever. But before I left, I did one more thing. I researched Eleanor Vasquez's disappearance more thoroughly, looking for any detail that might explain what I'd experienced. What I found changed everything. According to the police report, Eleanor's car had been discovered on October 18, 1987, 3 days after she went missing. But there was a detail that hadn't made it into the newspaper article. The car's engine was still running when security found it. After 3 days, the Buick was still in perfect mechanical condition with a full tank of gas, as if it had just been parked moments before. The police couldn't explain how the vehicle had continued running for 72 hours without anyone noticing. The security guard who found the car reported that it was warm to the touch and the radio was playing. But when investigators arrived, everything appeared normal except for the missing driver. Eleanor Vasquez never made it home from work that night, but her car waited for her in space B5 to 127, engine running and radio playing, for 3 days before being discovered. And apparently, 35 years later, it's still waiting. I've never gone back to the Meridian Plaza garage, but sometimes when I'm driving through downtown Seattle late at night, I think about Eleanor sitting peacefully in her Buick 6 levels underground, taking a moment to rest before heading home to a husband who's been waiting for her since 1987. Some people get lost between one moment and the next, caught in a space where time moves differently and reality follows rules that don't apply to the rest of us. The Meridian Plaza garage is one of those spaces, and Eleanor Vasquez is still there, still trying to finish her journey home. The new security guard probably sees her car occasionally, probably reports it as an unauthorized vehicle and gets frustrated when it disappears before morning. Probably thinks he's losing his mind when the photos don't turn out and the license plate doesn't match any records. But Eleanor isn't unauthorized. She belongs there more than any of us ever will. She's just waiting for the right moment to continue. Her drive home. Image prompt for story 1. Dark underground parking garage level B5. Security guard with flashlight standing near vintage 1987 burgundy Buick LeSime. Concrete pillars casting long shadows, fluorescent lights creating pools of harsh illumination, empty parking spaces numbered on concrete pillars, institutional gray atmosphere, security camera visible in background. Story 2. The Midnight Parker. My name is Rachel, and I've been working security at various parking facilities around Phoenix for the past 8 years. Industrial complexes, shopping centers, office buildings, you name it. I've probably walked those concrete floors in the middle of the night. But the West Side Medical Center garage is the one job I'll never forget, and the one location I'll never work again. The medical center is a massive complex on the west side of Phoenix, serving as both a general hospital and a specialized treatment facility. The parking garage attached to the main building has 8 levels, 2 above ground for visitors and emergency parking, and 6 underground levels for staff, long-term patients, and overflow. It's one of those newer structures, built in the early 2000s with updated lighting, security cameras, and electronic access controls. I was hired to work the midnight to 8 a.m. shift, responsible for all 8 levels, but with special attention to the underground sections where expensive medical equipment was sometimes transported and where staff vehicles were parked overnight. The job paid well because medical facilities require higher security clearances and more detailed reporting than standard commercial parking. The staff briefing emphasized that medical personnel worked irregular hours and that I might encounter doctors or nurses coming and going at any time during my shift. I was instructed to be helpful but not intrusive, to verify hospital ID badges when requested, and to report any suspicious activity immediately to both hospital security and my supervisor. For the first 6 months, the job was exactly what I expected. Quiet, routine, with occasional encounters with exhausted medical staff heading home after long shifts or arriving early for emergency procedures. The garage was well lit, professionally maintained, and equipped with an efficient security camera system that covered every angle. The underground levels were arranged logically: B1 and B2 for senior staff and physicians, B3 and B4 for nurses and administrative personnel, B5 and B6 for general hospital employees and overflow parking. Each level was clearly marked with large floor numbers and color-coded sections to help people remember where they'd parked. It was during my 7th month that I first encountered Margaret. I was conducting my routine 3 a.m. sweep of level B4 when I noticed a woman standing next to a Honda Accord in Section C near the elevator banks. She was elderly, probably in her 70s, wearing a blue dress and carrying a small purse. She appeared confused, looking around as if she couldn't quite remember where she was or what she was doing. I approached her carefully. Elderly patients sometimes got disoriented in hospitals, and my training emphasized the importance of being helpful while also determining if someone needed medical attention. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said gently. "Can I help you find something?" She looked at me with relief, as if she'd been waiting for someone to notice her. "Oh, thank goodness. I can't seem to find my car. I know I parked it somewhere around here, but everything looks the same." This was a common problem. The garage was large and the sections could be confusing, especially for people who didn't use the facility regularly. I'd helped dozens of people locate their vehicles over the months. "No problem," I told her. "What kind of car are you looking for?" "A blue Oldsmobile," she said. 1994 Cutlass Supreme. I've had it for years, never given me any trouble at all. I always park it in the same section when I come for my appointments, but tonight everything seems different somehow. I looked around Section C. There were about 30 vehicles parked in that area, but I didn't see any blue Oldsmobiles. Mostly newer cars, Honda and Toyota sedans, a few pickup trucks. "Do you remember what section you usually park in?" I asked. "Sometimes the layout can seem different at night with the lighting." Margaret thought for a moment. "Section C," she said. "Always Section C. It's close to the elevator, and I don't walk as well as I used to." We were standing in Section See, I made a mental note to check the other levels, thinking perhaps she'd parked on a different floor and gotten confused. Let me help you look, I offered. We can check the other levels, and if we can't find it, I can call hospital security. Sometimes people remember the wrong day or the wrong garage. Margaret smiled gratefully. That's very kind of you. I don't know what's wrong with me lately. I feel like I'm forgetting things more than I should. We spent 20 minutes searching every level of the garage. I checked my security logs to see what vehicles had entered during the previous few hours, but there was no record of a 1994 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. In fact, according to the gate logs, no vehicles matching that description had entered the garage in the past week. Mrs. I realized I didn't know her last name. Henley, she provided. Margaret Henley. Mrs. Henley, are you sure you drove here? Tonight? Sometimes family members drop patients off for late appointments, or there might be a shuttle service. Margaret looked confused. Of course I drove. I always drive myself to my appointments. I'm very careful, never had an accident in my life. The doctor says I shouldn't be driving anymore, but I feel fine. I just can't seem to find my car. I was starting to suspect that Margaret might be experiencing some kind of medical emergency, possibly related to memory or orientation. Elderly patients sometimes had episodes of confusion, and the responsible thing would be to contact hospital staff. Mrs. Henley, why don't we go inside and speak with someone at the information desk? They might be able to help us figure out what's going on. But when I turned toward the elevator, Margaret was gone. I looked around Section C, checked behind the parked vehicles, even called out her name. Nothing. Margaret Henley had vanished as completely as her blue Oldsmobile, leaving me standing, alone in the fluorescent-lit garage with no explanation for where she'd gone. I spent the rest of my shift checking the security cameras, reviewing footage from the past few hours to see if I could spot Margaret entering or leaving the garage. What I found was disturbing. The cameras clearly showed me walking through Level B4 at 3 a.m. They showed me stopping in Section C, apparently speaking to someone, but Margaret wasn't visible in any of the footage. The cameras recorded me having a 20-minute conversation with empty air, gesturing and responding to someone who cast. No shadow and left no trace on the electronic surveillance system. I reported the incident to my supervisor and to hospital security, describing the encounter as accurately as possible. They were concerned about the implications. Either I was having some kind of psychological episode, or there were gaps in the security camera coverage that could pose a serious problem. Hospital security reviewed their patient records and found no appointments scheduled for a Margaret Henley. They also checked their database of regular patients and employees, but found no one by that name associated with the medical center. The next night, I was conducting my 3 a.m. rounds when I saw Margaret again. Asterisk, asterisk. This time she was on Level B2, standing next to a different Honda Accord, still carrying her small purse and still looking confused. She was wearing the same blue dress and appeared exactly as she had the night before. "Oh, there you are," she said when she saw me, as if we'd arranged to meet. "I still can't find my car. I've been looking all night." I approached her carefully, trying to determine if this was the same woman or possibly someone else who resembled the previous night's encounter. "Mrs. Henley?" I asked. "Yes, that's right. You remember me." She seemed pleased. "Have you seen my blue Oldsmobile? I know I parked it somewhere around here." I decided to try a different approach. Instead of offering to help search, I asked her about her appointment. "What kind of appointment did you have tonight, Mrs. Henley?" Margaret looked puzzled. "Appointment? Oh yes. I see Dr. Richardson every month for my medication, blood pressure pills. He's a wonderful doctor, very patient with all my questions." I made a mental note to ask hospital security about Dr. Richardson. If Margaret was a regular patient, there should be records of her visits and her prescriptions. "What time was your appointment?" I asked. 10 o'clock, Margaret replied. "But I always arrive early to find a good parking spot." I don't see as well at night as I used to. Mrs. Henley, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. Your appointment would have been 5 hours ago. ***. Margaret stared at me as if I'd said something incomprehensible. 3 o'clock? That can't be right. I just got here. I remember driving into the garage, finding my parking spot in Section C. That was maybe half an hour ago. We talked for another 15 minutes. Margaret remained convinced that she'd recently arrived for a 10 o'clock appointment, despite clear evidence that it was the middle of the night. She had no memory of our conversation from the previous evening, and no awareness that time had passed in ways that didn't make sense. When I tried to escort her to the hospital entrance to speak with staff, she disappeared again, vanishing between one moment and the next while my attention was briefly focused on the elevator buttons. The security cameras recorded the same phenomenon. Me talking to empty air for 15 minutes, responding to questions that no one had asked, and providing information that no one was there to receive. I spent my meal break researching Dr. Richardson. According to the hospital directory, there was no physician by that name currently on staff. There had been a Dr. Richardson who worked in cardiology during the 1990s, but he'd retired in 1999 and passed away in 2003. The next morning, I contacted the local newspaper and searched their online archives for any mention of Margaret Henley. What I found was an obituary from November 1999. Margaret Henley, 74 years old, died in a single-car accident in the Westside Medical Center parking garage. According to the article, she'd been a regular patient of Dr. Richardson's cardiology practice, receiving monthly checkups for a heart condition. On the night of November 10th, 1999, she apparently became disoriented while looking for her car after a late appointment and drove off the edge of level B2, falling to the concrete floor below. The accident was attributed to confusion and poor visibility. Margaret's blue 1994 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme was totaled in the fall, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The article mentioned that family members had been concerned about her driving at night and had encouraged her to use transportation services. But Margaret had insisted she was capable of driving herself to medical appointments. The obituary also noted that Margaret had been found several hours after the accident occurred. She'd apparently spent considerable time wandering the garage, looking for her car, before the fatal fall. According to the date stamp on the article, Margaret Henley died exactly 24 years ago. Almost to the day, I continued working at the medical center for another month, and I encountered Margaret 12 more times. Always at 3 a.m., always confused about the location of her car, always wearing the same blue dress and carrying the same small purse. Our conversations followed similar patterns, with Margaret expressing confusion about the time and insisting that she'd recently arrived for an appointment with Dr. Richardson. Sometimes I found her on level B2, sometimes on B4, occasionally on other levels. But she was always looking for her blue Oldsmobile, always convinced that she'd parked it in Section C, and always unaware that decades had passed since her last real appointment. I started documenting our conversations, taking notes on everything Margaret said and did. What emerged was a pattern of behavior that suggested she was reliving the same experience over and quoting over again, arriving for her monthly appointment, parking her car, and then becoming lost in the garage while trying to leave. But there were variations in the pattern that troubled me. Sometimes Margaret mentioned details that didn't match the historical record. She talked about driving conditions that evening, traffic patterns, construction work that I couldn't verify. She described conversations with hospital staff who might not have been working that night, appointments scheduled at times that didn't correspond to the cardiology department's hours. It was as if Margaret existed in multiple overlapping timelines, experiencing different versions of her final night simultaneously. Sometimes she was reliving November 15th, 1999, exactly as it had happened. Other times she was experiencing versions of that night where small details had changed, where different choices had been made, where the outcome might have been different. During our last conversation, Margaret seemed more lucid than usual. "You're very kind to keep helping me," she said. "But I think I'm beginning to understand something. I've been looking for my car for a very long time, haven't I?" I nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Henley, you have. And I'm never going to find it, am I?" She continued, "Because something happened that night. Something bad." "Yes," I said gently. "Something happened." Margaret smiled sadly. "I remember now. The fall. It was so quick, I hardly had time to be frightened. Dr. Richardson always told me I should stop driving at night, but I was so stubborn. I thought I was fine." We stood together in the fluorescent-lit garage, surrounded by cars that belonged to people who would eventually drive them home. "I keep looking for my car, because that's what I was doing when it happened," Margaret continued. "But the car is gone, isn't it? It was destroyed in the fall." "Yes, Mrs. Henley, the car was destroyed." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Then I suppose I should stop looking for it." I never saw Margaret Henley again after that night. She didn't disappear dramatically or fade away like a movie ghost. We said goodbye. She walked toward the elevator, and I simply never encountered her again during my remaining weeks at the medical center. I left that job because I couldn't handle the emotional weight of knowing that Margaret was still lost somewhere in the garage, still looking for a car that had been destroyed 24 years ago. But also because I realized that parking garages exist in a strange space between destinations, places where people transition from one part of their lives to another. Sometimes that transition gets interrupted. Sometimes people get lost between where they've been and where they're going, caught in a moment that refuses to end properly. Margaret Henley spent her last night alive looking for her car in a confusing garage. And some part of her never stopped looking. She was trapped in that moment of frustration and disorientation, replaying it endlessly because she couldn't move forward to what came next. But I hope that our final conversation helped her understand that the search was over, that it was okay to stop looking and move on to whatever comes after we lose the things we think we need to get home. The new security guard at the medical center probably encounters confused elderly patients sometimes. People who can't remember where they parked or what section they're in. Probably helps them find their cars and thinks nothing of it. But if he ever meets a woman in a blue dress looking for a 1994 Oldsmobile that doesn't appear in any of the security logs, I hope he's as patient with her as she deserves, because some searches last longer than the lifetime of the person doing the searching. Image. Prompt for Story 2. Underground Medical Center parking garage level. B2. Elderly woman in blue dress standing alone next to modern Honda Accord. Security guard with flashlight in background. Clinical fluorescent lighting. Concrete support pillars. Visible Section C signage. Empty parking spaces creating sense of isolation. Story 3. The Elevator Guardian. My name is David, and I worked security at the Metropolitan Financial Tower parking garage in downtown Denver for 18 months. 24 floors of underground parking beneath a 60-story office building, serving thousands of employees and visitors every day. During business hours, the garage was a constant flow of vehicles and pedestrians. But from midnight to 6 a.m., when I worked my shift, it became something entirely different. The Metropolitan Financial Tower was completed in 2010, representing the latest in commercial building design and technology. The parking garage incorporated advanced systems for everything from traffic flow management to environmental controls, motion-activated lighting, computerized space tracking, and an elevator system that could transport 50 people per minute during peak hours. My job was to monitor the garage during overnight hours, ensuring security and performing maintenance checks on the various automated systems. Most nights, I spent my time walking the different levels, checking for unauthorized vehicles, confirming that all electronic systems were functioning correctly, and responding to occasional calls from cleaning crews or maintenance personnel. The elevator system was particularly sophisticated. 6 passenger elevators and 2 freight elevators, all controlled by a central computer that optimized traffic flow and minimized wait times. During business hours, the system handled thousands of trips per day with remarkable efficiency. But during my shift, when the garage was mostly empty, the elevators sometimes exhibited behaviors that weren't covered in any of the technical manuals. It started with small anomalies. Elevators arriving at floors where no one had called them, doors opening and closing in empty lobbies, cars moving between levels without any record of button presses or electronic commands. The building's technical staff assured me that these were normal functions of the computerized system, routine maintenance cycles, and diagnostic procedures that occurred automatically during low traffic periods. But after my 3rd month on the job, the anomalies became more frequent and more specific. I was conducting a routine check of level B12 when elevator number 4 arrived without being called. The doors opened, revealing an empty car with all the button lights illuminated, as if someone had pressed every floor from B1 to B24. I stepped inside to reset the system, but before I could reach the control panel, the doors closed and the elevator began ascending rapidly. It stopped at level B8, doors opened onto an empty corridor, waited exactly 30 seconds, then closed and continued upward. At B5, the same pattern. Doors opened, 30-second wait, doors closed. This continued for every floor until we reached B1, where the elevator finally stopped and the button lights turned off. I reported the incident to building maintenance, who ran diagnostics on the elevator system but found no malfunctions. According to their records, Elevator 4 had remained stationary on level B12 for the entire night, with no recorded trips or system activations. The next night, it happened again. Same elevator, same pattern of stops, same 30-second waits at each floor. But this time I paid closer attention to what occurred during those 30-second intervals. Each time the doors opened, I could hear faint sounds from the corridor beyond, footsteps, the rustle of clothing, the soft chime of the elevator call button being pressed. But the corridors were empty. I was alone in the elevator, and the security cameras showed no activity on any of the levels where we stopped. On the 3rd night, I decided to test the system more thoroughly. When Elevator 4 arrived at level B12, I stepped inside, but positioned myself so I could see out into the corridor while still preventing the doors from closing. I wanted to observe what happened during the 30-second waits without moving to the next floor. Level B, 8 doors opened, and I heard the distinct sound of someone entering the elevator behind me. The weight sensors registered additional occupancy. According to the display panel, the elevator now carried 3 people instead of 1. But I was alone in the car, and no one had physically entered. Level B5, more footsteps, more rustling. The weight sensors now showed 8 occupants. The elevator was becoming crowded with people I couldn't see but who were apparently real enough to trigger the building's sophisticated passenger detection. Systems, level B2, 14 occupants. According to the sensors, I could hear breathing, quiet conversations, the sound of someone shifting a briefcase from one hand to another. The elevator was packed with invisible passengers, all apparently riding upward together towards some destination I couldn't comprehend. At level B1, I heard the sound of people exiting the elevator, footsteps moving past me toward the corridor, the rustle of clothing, even a woman's voice saying, "Excuse me," as she brushed past. Within 10 seconds, the weight sensors returned to showing 1 occupant, just me. The elevator doors closed, and I rode down to level B12 in complete silence. I spent my meal break that night researching the building's history, looking for any incidents or unusual events that might explain what I was experiencing. What I found was a newspaper article from September 12, 2001. Denver office building evacuated following New York attacks. The article described how the Metropolitan Financial Tower, along with many other high-rise buildings across the country, had been evacuated as a precautionary measure following the attacks on the World Trade Center. Thousands of employees had been ordered to leave their offices and exit the building immediately, creating massive crowds in the parking garage as people rushed to their vehicles. The evacuation had proceeded smoothly for the most part, but there had been one tragic incident. Elevator 4 had malfunctioned during the evacuation, trapping 14 passengers between levels B5 and B6 for over 3 hours. While no one was seriously injured, several passengers had experienced panic attacks and medical emergencies during the extended confinement. The article included quotes from some of the trapped passengers, describing their fear and confusion as they waited for rescue in a crowded elevator car while sirens wailed outside and nobody could explain what was happening or when they would be freed. But what struck me most was the passenger list, published in the follow-up article 3 days later. 14 names, including job titles and the floors where they worked: accountants from the 10th floor, lawyers from the 32nd floor, administrative assistants from various departments, and a security supervisor from the building management office. I recognized one of the names immediately: Patricia Mills, executive assistant. 47th floor. Patricia Mills was the woman who had said "excuse me" as she passed by me in the elevator. The next night, I positioned myself on level B8 when elevator 4 began its routine. Instead of riding along, I waited in the corridor and watched as the empty elevator stopped at my floor. The doors opened, and I heard the sound of someone stepping out into the corridor. Footsteps moved past me toward the exit doors, a steady rhythm that suggested someone walking with purpose and familiarity. I followed the sound, staying about 10 feet behind, listening to the clear pattern of dress shoes against concrete flooring. The footsteps led directly to parking space B8 to 147, where they stopped. I heard the electronic chirp of a car alarm being deactivated, the sound of a car door opening and closing, and then the engine starting. But space B8 to 147 was empty. No car, no driver, no evidence that anything had occurred except for the fading sound of an engine that had somehow started. Without a vehicle, I checked the parking records for space B8 to 147. According to the database, it had been assigned to Patricia Mills from 1998 until her death in 2003. She had worked in the building for 5 years, parking in the same space every day, using the elevator system to travel from the garage to her office on the 47th floor. Patricia Mills had been one of the 14 passengers trapped in elevator 4 on September 11, 2001. Over the following weeks, I documented the elevator's behavior more systematically. Every night at approximately 2:30 a.m., elevator 4 would begin its journey from level B12 to B1, stopping at each floor to collect passengers who had died years earlier, but who continued to ride the elevator system as if they were still reporting to work. I identified several other passengers by researching the parking records and matching spaces to footstep patterns. Robert Chun, accountant from the 15th floor, always exited at level B15 where his Toyota Camry had been parked for 3 years until his heart attack in 2004. Michelle Rodriguez, legal secretary from the 28th floor, exited at level B6 where her Honda Civic had been assigned, until she moved to Seattle in 2005 and died in a car accident 6 months later. Each of them had been trapped in elevator 4 on September 11, 2001. Each of them had experienced the fear and confusion of being confined in a small space, while the world seemed to be ending outside. And each of them, it seemed, was still trying to complete that interrupted journey from their office to their car. The elevator had become a time loop, replaying the same trip over and over again for passengers who had never quite finished traveling from their workplace to their parking space. They rode the elevator every night at 2:30 a.m., the same time they had originally entered the elevator car during the building evacuation 22 years earlier. But unlike other paranormal encounters I'd heard about, these passengers weren't trapped in the moment of trauma. They had successfully completed their evacuation, had gone home to their families that night, had lived normal lives for years after September 11th. They were trapped in the moment of routine, the everyday action of riding the elevator from office to parking garage. It was the mundane nature of their situation that disturbed me most. These weren't tormented souls reliving moments of terror or tragedy. They were people going through the ordinary motions of ending their workday, pressing elevator buttons and making small talk and saying, "Excuse me," when they needed to squeeze past someone in a crowded car. Death had interrupted their routines in different ways and at different times. But the elevator continued to provide the service it had always provided, transporting them from the office building to the parking garage where their cars waited. During my final month at the Metropolitan Financial Tower, I tried communicating with the elevator passengers. I would position myself in the corridor and speak to the empty space where I heard footsteps, asking questions and trying to provide information about current events or changes in the building. The responses were subtle but unmistakable. Footsteps would pause when I spoke, as if someone had stopped to listen. Occasionally, I would hear fragments of conversation. "Did you hear something?" Or, "I thought someone was talking." But they never responded directly to my questions, and they never seemed fully aware of my presence. They existed in their own timeline, focused on their own concerns, traveling from office to car with the automatic efficiency of people who had made the same trip thousands of times. One night, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of speaking to them, I simply said, "Thank you for your service," as the invisible passengers passed by me in the corridor. The footsteps stopped completely. For nearly 30 seconds, the corridor was silent. Then I heard Patricia Mills' voice, clear and unmistakable. "You're welcome. Have a good evening." I never encountered the elevator passengers again after that night. Elevator 4 continued to function normally, responding only to actual button presses and electronic commands. The late-night maintenance cycles became routine and predictable. Without any unexplained stops or phantom passengers, I left the Metropolitan Financial Tower job a few weeks later. Not because of fear or discomfort, but because I felt like my role there had been completed. The elevator passengers had been acknowledged, thanked for their years of dedicated service, and given permission to finish their journey to whatever destination comes after the parking garage. The building's new security guard probably notices occasional quirks in the elevator system, minor anomalies that don't quite match the technical specifications. But I hope he never has to experience the weight of knowing that some people continue reporting to work long after their employment has ended, riding the same elevator car they used for years, traveling between a job they know, longer hold, and a car they no longer drive. Because the most haunting thing about the Metropolitan Financial Tower wasn't that 14 people had been trapped in an elevator during a national emergency. It was that they had made the same trip so many times, followed the same routine so consistently, that death couldn't break the pattern. Work becomes a kind of muscle memory, and sometimes that memory outlasts the muscles that created it. Story 4. The Concrete Stalker. My name is Anthony, and I spent 2 years working night security at the Harbor View Shopping Complex parking structure in San Diego. 4 levels of concrete and steel serving, a mid-sized shopping mall, 2 movie theaters, and several chain restaurants. During evening hours, the structure was busy with shoppers and diners. But during my shift, From 1 a.m. to 9 a.m., it became a different place entirely. The harbor view structure was built in the early 1980s, designed with function over form in mind. Raw concrete walls, exposed steel beams, and industrial lighting that cast sharp shadows between the support columns. The architects had prioritized maximum vehicle capacity and efficient traffic flow, creating a space that felt more like a fortress than a shopping destination. My job responsibilities included monitoring the entire structure, checking for unauthorized overnight parking, ensuring that delivery vehicles had proper access to loading docks, and responding to any security incidents. Most of my shift was spent walking the different levels, conducting hourly rounds and maintaining visual contact with all sections of the garage. The structure was arranged with level 1 as ground floor parking for short-term shoppers, level 2 for employees and movie theater patrons, level 3 for restaurant customers and overflow parking, and level 4 as the roof level with open-air parking and access to the shopping mall's upper-level stores docked during overnight hours. The structure was supposed to be empty, except for a few authorized vehicles belonging to cleaning crews, maintenance workers, and overnight restaurant staff. But from my first week on the job, I noticed patterns that didn't match the official schedule. Vehicles would appear in unauthorized areas, parked in sections that should have been completely vacant. When I investigated these cars, they always turned out to have legitimate reasons for being there. Overnight employees who had gotten permission to park in convenient spots, delivery drivers taking breaks between routes, or shopping mall tenants who had special arrangements with management. But the people associated with these vehicles were never anywhere to be found. I would see Honda Civic parked in a restricted zone on level 3. Check the license plate against authorized vehicle lists. Find that it belonged to Maria Santos, who worked at the food court and had permission to park overnight during inventory periods. But when I went to the food court to verify, Maria wasn't there. Her supervisor would tell me she had called in sick that evening or had left hours earlier. Meanwhile, her car sat in the parking structure with no indication of how it had gotten there or where she had gone. This pattern repeated constantly. Authorized vehicles in appropriate locations, but missing drivers who should have been working their overnight shifts. The cars were real, the parking permits were legitimate, and the employees existed. But the people were never where they were supposed to be when their vehicles were present in the garage. After my 3rd month, I started documenting these discrepancies more carefully. I created a log of every vehicle I encountered during my shifts, noting license plates, parking locations, employee names, and follow-up verification attempts. What emerged was a disturbing pattern. Every vehicle I found belonged to someone who had worked at the shopping complex and who had died while employed there. Maria Santos, food court employee, had died of a heart attack in 2019 while working a late shift. Her Honda Civic continued to appear in the employee parking section every Tuesday night. The same day she had always worked her weekly inventory shifts. Robert Kim, movie theater assistant manager, had died in a car accident in 2020 while driving home from the late showing. His Toyota pickup truck appeared in the management parking area every weekend, positioned in the same spot where he had parked during his 5 years of employment. Jennifer Walsh, restaurant server, had died of cancer in 2021 after battling the disease for 2 years while continuing to work part-time. Her Nissan sedan appeared in the restaurant employee section every Thursday and Friday, the days she had scheduled her shifts around. Chemotherapy treatments. The vehicles were not ghostly apparitions or transparent manifestations. They were solid, real automobiles that triggered motion sensors, reflected light normally, and appeared clearly on security cameras. If I tried to touch them, I encountered normal metal and glass surfaces. If I looked inside, I could see typical car interiors with personal belongings and work uniforms hanging from hooks. But the people who owned these cars were dead. and their employment with the shopping complex had ended years earlier. I reported these findings to my supervisor, Janet, who initially suggested that family members might be using the vehicles and the parking permits. But when we investigated further, we discovered that most of the cars had been sold, donated, or scrapped after the employees' deaths. The vehicles appearing in the garage were cars that no longer existed in any legal or practical sense. Janet contacted the shopping mall management and the various business owners to verify employee records and parking permissions. Every business confirmed that the individuals in question had been valued employees who had died while working for them. And several managers mentioned that they still maintained reserved parking spaces in honor of their deceased workers, but none of them had authorized continued use of those parking spaces, and none of them could explain how vehicles that had been disposed of years earlier were appearing in their designated locations. Breakthrough came during my 4th month when I decided to observe one of the vehicles more closely throughout an entire shift. Robert Kim's Toyota pickup had appeared in its usual management parking spot on level 2 instead of simply noting its presence and moving on. I positioned myself behind a support column where I could maintain visual contact with the vehicle for several hours. At 3:30 a.m. I saw Robert. He emerged from the stairwell door, walking with the casual confidence of someone who was familiar with the parking structure and knew exactly where he was going. He was wearing the movie theater's management uniform, dark slacks, white shirt, and a tie with the theater chain's logo. He appeared to be in his 30s, matching the age in employee photographs I had found in newspaper articles about his death. Robert walked directly to his pickup truck, unlocked it with a key fob, and climbed into the driver's seat. He sat there for about 10 minutes, and I could see him in the cab, apparently reviewing paperwork or checking his phone. Then he started the engine, backed out of the parking space, and drove toward the exit ramp. I followed him through the structure, staying far enough behind to avoid detection, but close enough to observe his route. Robert drove methodically through each level, taking the same path that employees used when leaving the building. But when he reached the exit gate on level 1, instead of continuing onto the street, he turned around and drove back up to level 2. He parked in the same management spot where I had first seen the truck, turned off the engine, and sat in the cab for another 10 minutes. Then he got out, locked the vehicle, and walked back toward the stairwell door. But he never reached the door. Somewhere between the pickup truck and the stairwell, Robert simply ceased to exist. One moment he was walking across the concrete. The next moment, the parking structure was empty except for his vehicle. I rushed to the stairwell and checked every floor, thinking he might have used a different exit or taken an elevator. But Robert was nowhere to be found, and the stairwell showed no signs of recent use. It was as if he had dissolved into the air. Over the following weeks, I observed similar patterns with other deceased employees. They would appear in the parking structure, walk to their vehicles, sit inside for varying periods of time, and then disappear while attempting to leave the building. None of them ever successfully exited the parking structure. They were trapped in a loop that began with retrieving their cars and ended somewhere between the parking space and the outside world. The most disturbing observation was that they all appeared to be unaware of their situation. Robert went through the normal routine of checking his paperwork and starting his engine, as if he were simply ending another shift at the movie theater. Maria organized items in her Honda Civic as if she were preparing to drive home after completing food court inventory. Jennifer sat in her Nissan sedan reviewing what looked like customer receipts, the same task she had performed every night after serving tables at the restaurant. They were not tormented or distressed. They were simply trying to go home after work, following the same routine they had followed hundreds of times while they were alive. But something about the parking structure prevented them from completing that final journey. They could retrieve their cars, they could sit inside and prepare to leave, but they couldn't actually exit the building and drive away. During my 6th month, I decided to try communicating with one of the deceased employees. When Jennifer Walsh appeared and began walking toward her car, I stepped out from behind my concealment and called her name. "Jennifer? Jennifer Walsh?" She stopped and turned toward me, looking puzzled but not frightened. "Yes, do I know you?" "I'm Anthony, the night security guard. I just wanted to thank you for all your hard work at the restaurant." Jennifer smiled, the same expression I had seen in newspaper photos from her memorial service. "That's very kind of you. I love working here. The customers are wonderful, and the other servers have become like family." She was speaking in present tense, as if her employment were ongoing. I decided to test her awareness of current circumstances. "How long have you been working here, Jennifer?" "Almost 3 years now," she replied. "Best job I've ever had. I'm saving up to go back to school, maybe study nursing. I've always wanted to help people." According to the records I had found, Jennifer had been diagnosed with cancer during her 2nd year of employment. She had continued working throughout her treatment, maintaining her positive attitude and dedication to customer service even as her health declined. She had died during her 3rd year with the restaurant, never having the opportunity to pursue nursing school. "Jennifer, do you remember being sick at all? Any problems with your health?" Her expression became confused. "Sick? No, I feel fine. I mean, I get tired sometimes after long shifts, but everyone does." "Why do you ask?" She had no memory of her illness, no awareness of the 2-year battle with cancer that had ultimately taken her life. In her perception, she was still a healthy young woman saving money for college and enjoying her work at the restaurant. "I just wanted to make sure you were taking care of yourself," I said gently. "Sometimes people work too hard and don't pay attention to warning signs." Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. "That's good advice. I should probably get more rest. But I need the hours, you know. School is expensive." We talked for another 5 minutes. Jennifer described her plans for the weekend, mentioned a customer who had complimented her service that evening, and asked if I enjoyed working security at the shopping complex. She was exactly as warm and friendly as her former coworkers had described her, maintaining the same optimistic outlook that had impressed everyone who knew her. When our conversation ended, Jennifer walked to her car and went through her usual routine of organizing receipts and preparing to leave. I watched as she started the engine and began backing out of the parking space, hoping that somehow our interaction might help her break free from the pattern that trapped her. But the result was the same. Jennifer drove toward the exit, turned around before reaching the street, returned to her parking space, and disappeared somewhere between her car and the restaurant entrance. I tried similar conversations with Robert and Maria over the following weeks. All of them were friendly and professional, pleased to meet the night security guard and happy to talk about their work and their plans for the future. But none of them had any awareness that their plans had been interrupted by death, and none of them could successfully leave the parking structure. They were stuck in an endless cycle of finishing work, retrieving their cars, and attempting to drive home to lives that no longer existed. During my final month at Harbor View, I noticed a new pattern. The deceased employees were beginning to acknowledge each other's presence. Previously, each of them had existed in isolation, focused only on their own routine of leaving work and preparing to drive home. But I started observing interactions between them. Robert would nod to Jennifer when they passed each other in the parking structure. Maria would smile and wave at both of them. They were developing the casual friendships that form between people who work different shifts but see each other regularly during transition times. It was as if the parking structure was becoming a social space for employees who could no longer go home. They were building relationships based on their shared experience of being permanently stuck between work and the rest of their lives. I left the Harborview job because I couldn't handle watching good people trapped in a situation they didn't understand and couldn't escape, but also because I realized that for some employees, work becomes such a central part of identity that even death can't break the habit of showing up for shifts. The shopping complex continues to honor deceased employees by maintaining their parking spaces. But those spaces aren't empty memorials. They're occupied every night by people who are still trying to complete the simple task of going home after work. The new security guard probably notices cars appearing in areas that should be vacant, probably checks employee lists and finds that the vehicles belong to people who have legitimate reasons to be there. Probably never realizes that some employees continue reporting for duty long after their employment has officially ended, because the most faithful workers sometimes can't accept that the job is finished and it's time to clock out for the final time. Story 5, The Final Space. My name is Eric, and I worked security at the downtown Civic Center parking structure in Portland, Oregon for 4 years. 6 levels of public parking serving the courthouse, city hall, several government offices, and a public library. It was the kind of facility that stayed busy during business hours, with people attending court hearings, paying taxes, applying for permits, or researching family genealogy at the library. But from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. when I worked my shift, the structure served a different purpose entirely. The Civic Center garage was built in 1995 as part of a larger urban renewal project. Modern design with excellent lighting, security cameras throughout, and electronic access controls that tracked every vehicle entering and exiting the facility. The structure was managed by the city's parking authority and maintained to higher standards than most commercial garages. My responsibilities included monitoring all 6 levels, responding to emergency calls, assisting late-night courthouse staff, and ensuring that the structure remained secure during overnight hours. I also handled administrative duties related to monthly parking permits and special event coordination. The structure's layout was straightforward. Level 1 for short-term public parking, Level 2 for courthouse staff and attorneys, Level 3 for City Hall employees, Level 4 for library staff and researchers, Level 5 for overflow and special events, and Level 6 as the roof level with open parking and access to the courthouse's upper floors. During my first year, I noticed that certain parking spaces seemed to attract vehicles with unusual frequency. Not the convenient spaces near elevators or entrances, but specific spots scattered throughout the structure that appeared to have some kind of magnetic appeal for particular types of vehicles. Space 2 to 47, for example, was consistently occupied by older sedan cars driven by elderly drivers. Space 3 to 22 attracted pickup trucks and SUVs owned by people who appeared to be contractors or manual laborers. Space 4 to 15 was used almost exclusively by compact cars driven by young people, usually college students or recent graduates. Initially, I attributed these patterns to coincidence or practical factors I hadn't considered. Perhaps Space 2 to 47 had better lighting for elderly drivers, or Space 3 to 22 provided easier maneuvering for larger vehicles. But after months of observation, I realized that the patterns were too consistent to be explained by convenience or preference. The vehicles that used these spaces were connected by factors that had nothing to do with parking. Logistics. Space 2 to 47 was used by people who were dealing with end-of-life legal issues, updating wills, settling estates, arranging guardianships for elderly relatives. Space 3 to 22 attracted people who were facing foreclosure, bankruptcy, or other financial crises that threatened their livelihoods. Space 4 to 15 was chosen by young people who were struggling with student debt, unemployment, or other economic challenges that jeopardized their future plans. These weren't random correlations. The spaces seemed to draw people who were experiencing similar life circumstances, creating invisible communities based on shared struggles and concerns. But the most significant pattern involved space 6 to 66, located in the far corner of the roof level. Space 6 to 66 was used exclusively by people who would never leave the parking structure alive. I first noticed this pattern during my second year when I began tracking which vehicles used which spaces and correlating that information with local news reports and obituary notices. What I discovered was that space 6 to 66 had been the final parking spot for 23 people over the past decade. Heart attacks, strokes, suicides, accidents. The causes of death varied, but the location was consistent. People parked in space 6 to 66, entered the Civic Center building for court hearings or city business, and died before returning to their vehicles. The space itself appeared normal. Good lighting, standard dimensions, no obvious safety hazards or environmental factors that might contribute to health problems. But somehow, people who were about to experience fatal medical emergencies or make life-ending decisions were drawn to park in that specific location. During my third year, I started paying closer attention to the people who used space 6 to 66. I would position myself where I could observe them as they parked and walked toward the building entrances, looking for any signs or symptoms that might predict what was going to happen. Most of them appeared healthy and normal. Middle-aged business people attending routine court hearings, elderly couples updating their legal documents, young adults applying for marriage licenses or business permits. They walked with normal energy, spoke to each other in ordinary tones, showed no obvious signs of distress or unusual behavior, but there was something subtly different about their demeanor, a quality of finality in their movements, as if they were unconsciously aware that this trip to the Civic Center would be their last. They locked their cars more carefully than necessary, checked their paperwork multiple times, and often paused to look back at their vehicles before walking away. It was as if part of them knew they wouldn't be returning, even though their conscious minds had no reason to suspect anything unusual about the day ahead. The breakthrough in my understanding came during an encounter with Margaret Peterson, a 78-year-old woman who parked in space 6 to 66 on a Tuesday morning in November. I was conducting my routine morning inspection when I noticed Margaret sitting in her Buick sedan, engine off, apparently gathering her papers for heading into the courthouse. She had been sitting there for nearly 20 minutes, which was unusual. Most people parked and entered the building within a few minutes. I approached her vehicle and tapped gently on the passenger side window. Margaret looked up and smiled, rolling down the window to speak with me. "Good morning," I said. "I'm Eric, the security guard here. I just wanted to make sure everything was all right. You've been sitting here for a while." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, I have. I'm just trying to work up the courage to go inside and finalize my affairs." "Court hearing?" I asked. "Estate planning," Margaret replied. "I'm updating my will, arranging for power of attorney, all those things you're supposed to do when you get to be my age. My daughter has been nagging me about it for months." We talked for several minutes. Margaret was articulate and mentally sharp, describing her family situation and the legal documents she needed to complete. She seemed healthy and energetic, looking forward to spending time with her grandchildren and taking a cruise. She had been planning for years, but as our conversation continued, she made several comments that troubled me. "I want to make sure everything is in order," she said. "It's important to leave things properly organized so your family doesn't have to struggle with complicated paperwork." "That's very thoughtful," I replied. "But you seem like you're in good health. You probably have many years ahead of you." Margaret smiled sadly. "You never know, do you? My husband always said we should live each day as if it were our last, because one day we'll be right." She told me about her husband Robert, who had died 5 years earlier after a brief illness. She described their 47-year marriage, their 3 children, and the comfortable retirement they had enjoyed together before his death. Robert always handled our finances and legal affairs, Margaret continued. I never paid much attention to those details. But now I realize how much work it takes to keep everything properly organized. Are you feeling overwhelmed by all the paperwork? I asked, wondering if she might be experiencing anxiety that could affect her health. Not overwhelmed exactly, Margaret said. More like ready to have everything settled and complete. Does that make sense? I assured her that it made perfect sense, that estate planning was a responsible thing to do regardless of age or health status. We talked for another few minutes about her grandchildren, her garden, and her travel plans. She appeared to be looking forward to the future and had no obvious health concerns or depression symptoms. Margaret finally gathered her paperwork and walked toward the courthouse. I made a note to check on her when she returned to her vehicle. Something about our conversation had left me with a sense of unease. Though I couldn't identify any specific cause for concern, Margaret never returned to space 6 to 66, according to the newspaper report I found 3 days later. She had suffered a massive heart attack while sitting in the courthouse lobby, waiting for her appointment with the estate planning attorney. She died before the paramedics arrived, even though she had no history of heart problems and had received a clean bill of health during her physical examination 2 months earlier. Her Buick sedan was towed from Space 66 after sitting there for 24 hours. Her family later mentioned that Margaret had seemed unusually focused on completing her legal affairs during the weeks before her death, as if she had a premonition that time was running short. After Margaret's death, I began approaching other people who parked in Space 6 to 66, engaging them in conversation when possible, and trying to understand what drew them to that particular location. The responses were remarkably consistent. People who parked in Space 666 were always at the Civic Center to handle what they described as final business, completing wills, settling disputes, filing final paperwork for various legal matters. They used language that suggested closure and completion, even when discussing routine transactions. More importantly, they all expressed a sense that their business at the Civic Center was urgent, that it needed to be completed immediately rather than postponed or delayed. They couldn't explain why they felt such urgency about matters that had been pending for months or years, but they were compelled to resolve everything as quickly as possible. It was as if Space 6 to 66 attracted people who had unconscious awareness that their time was limited. People whose bodies or minds were already preparing for death, even when they appeared healthy and optimistic about the future. During my 4th year at the Civic Center, I decided to test my theory more directly. When I observed someone parking in Space 6 to 66, I would approach them and suggest that they might want to consider rescheduling their appointment, perhaps coming back another day when they felt more rested or had more time to deal with complicated paperwork. The results were disturbing. People who parked in Space 6 to 66 were absolutely resistant to any suggestion that they postpone their business at the Civic Center. They became agitated and insistent that they needed to complete their affairs immediately, that waiting even one more day was unacceptable. Some of them became visibly distressed when I suggested rescheduling, as if the idea of delay triggered profound anxiety about running out of time. When I tried to convince them to park in different spaces, claiming that 6 to 66 had mechanical problems with the lighting or security cameras, they would simply move their vehicles and then return to 6 to 66 within a few minutes. The space seemed to exert a magnetic pull on people who were approaching the end of their lives. I consulted with medical professionals about whether it was possible for people to have unconscious awareness of impending health crises. The responses were mixed, but several doctors mentioned that they had observed patients who seemed to prepare for death in subtle ways, weeks or months before experiencing fatal medical events. Dr. Sarah Chun, an emergency room physician, told me that she had noticed patterns in patients who arrived at the hospital with terminal conditions. Many of them had recently updated their wills, reconciled with estranged family members, or completed long-postponed personal projects, as if some part of their minds was aware that time was running short. The human body gives us signals that we don't always consciously recognize, Dr. Chun explained. Sometimes patients know they're dying before we do, even when all their test results look normal. This medical perspective supported my observations about Space 6 to 66. The people who parked there weren't randomly selected for death. They were people whose bodies were already preparing for the end, whose unconscious minds were driving them to complete final arrangements, even when their conscious thoughts were focused on future plans. During my final months at the Civic Center, I encountered one more person who helped me understand the true nature of space. 6-6. Thomas Walsh was a 45-year-old attorney who parked in the space on a Thursday afternoon. I observed him sitting in his BMW for nearly 30 minutes, making phone calls and reviewing legal documents. When I approached his vehicle, he was friendly and professional, explaining that he was updating his personal legal affairs before taking a vacation with his family. Big trip planned? I asked. 2 weeks in Europe, Thomas replied. My wife has wanted to see Paris and Rome since college, and our kids are finally old enough to appreciate the history and culture. Thomas described their itinerary in detail, museums they planned to visit, restaurants where they had reservations, historical sites they wanted to explore. He was clearly looking forward to the vacation, and had spent considerable time planning activities that would interest both adults and teenagers. But when I asked why he needed to update his legal documents before taking the family vacation, his expression became thoughtful. I'm not sure really, Thomas admitted. It just feels like something I should take care of before we leave. I've been putting off these updates for months, but suddenly it seems important to get everything organized. We talked for another 10 minutes. Thomas appeared healthy and energetic, discussing his law practice, his family, and his plans for the European vacation. But something about his demeanor suggested that he didn't really believe he would be taking that trip. Thomas, I said carefully, have you been feeling okay lately? Any health concerns or unusual symptoms? No, nothing like that, he replied. Actually, I feel better than I have in years. Lost 15 pounds, been exercising regularly, eating healthier food. My doctor says I'm in excellent shape for someone my age. Then why the urgency about updating your will? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. You know, I've been asking myself the same question. Logically, there's no reason to rush this paperwork. But I keep having this feeling that I need to get my affairs in order before something changes, before what changes. I don't know. That's the strange part. I can't identify any specific concern or worry. It's more like an instinct, like when you check to make sure you locked your car, even though you remember locking it. You can't explain why, but something tells you to. Double check. Thomas completed his legal business at the courthouse that afternoon and returned to his BMW around 5 p.m. I watched him drive carefully out of the parking structure, apparently in perfect health and looking forward to his family vacation. 2 weeks later, Thomas Walsh died in a car accident on Interstate 5, 2 days before his family was scheduled to leave for Europe. According to the police report, he had fallen asleep at the wheel while driving home from a client meeting, his BMW crossing the median and colliding with an oncoming truck. The accident report noted that Thomas had no history of sleep disorders or fatigue-related driving problems. He had been well rested and alert when he left his office that evening. But somehow, for the first time in his adult life, he had lost consciousness while behind the wheel of his car. His family later discovered that Thomas had updated all his legal documents the week before his death. ensuring that his estate planning was complete and his family would be financially secure. He had also taken care of numerous small details, prepaying bills, organizing insurance paperwork, and writing letters to his children that his wife found sealed in his desk drawer. It was as if Thomas had unconsciously prepared for his death while consciously planning a family vacation he would never take. I left the Civic Center parking structure after 4 years because I couldn't handle knowing that Space 6 to 66 would continue attracting people who were approaching the end of their lives, but also because I realized that some locations exist at the intersection between life and death, places where people gather to complete the final business of being human. Space 6 to 66 wasn't cursed or haunted. It was simply a location where people came to finish the essential task of organizing their affairs before moving on to whatever comes next. They parked there because some deeper part of their minds recognized that this trip to the Civic Center would be their last opportunity to ensure that everything was properly arranged for the people they would leave behind. The new security guard at the Civic Center probably notices that certain parking spaces seem to attract particular types of vehicles and drivers, probably observes patterns without understanding their significance. But I hope he pays attention to the people who park in Space 6 to 66, and I hope he's kind to them during what might be their final conversations with another human being, because some places exist to help people prepare for transitions they can't consciously acknowledge. And some parking spaces hold more than just cars. They hold the last earthly concerns of people who are getting ready to let go of everything else.